Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anna Hägg Sjöqvist. I'm the president of the Swedish Red Cross. And I will just do the opening here today because I wanted to have a chance to say a big thank you to all of you who has actually been giving us the possibility to do what we are actually doing on the ground in Ukraine and the countries around Ukraine. It has been a tremendous experience for us this spring because we have received so much engagement, both from the private sector and from the public sector. And for us, this is a way to sort of say thank you to all of you. And to do that, I have some colleagues with me. It's not only the colleagues from the Swedish Red Cross. You will soon meet with Anders Pedersen, who is our head of international department. But even more, I would like to welcome specifically Gilles Carbonnier, who is the vice president of the International Red Cross Committee, and Xavier Castellanos, who is Undersecretary General of International Red Cross Federation. So what is Red Cross Federation? Red Cross Federation is actually the network of all the national societies in the world. And then they will shortly share their knowledge and their experiences on the ground of Ukraine and how we have been assisting. But we need, of course, somebody to moderate this. So we have here with us today also our acting head of communication. And my goodness, sorry, I should know your name, and I do. Josephine Karlsson, right? I'm sorry. You know, the other day I was actually going to write a message to her, and I wrote Johanna, and now I got really worried again. Sorry. But before letting these men talk, we would actually also like to give some attention to our volunteers in Ukraine. We have so many volunteers in Ukraine who has been working all the time since February. And they keep working under quite difficult circumstances. And they are still there to do that. And I think we didn't have a chance to invite them. But what we did do is actually that we have a small film that will then be one of all the mothers who they had been helping. So I think we should just have a short look at that movie before we continue.
Hello, my name is Karina. I come here from Kharkov. I lost everything. I lost my flat, I lost my friends, I lost my life. We get here from bombs. My little son, 3 years old, and my mom with broken leg. My husband go to fight in the first day of war. And when we come here, we don't know here nobody. And it was very terrible because we alone, without any clothes, without anything. And when we come here, we get here friends, and for my little son, these people looks like a family. This young lady, his name is Sasha, and my little son loves her very much. And I want to say thank you everybody who do that.
Now, Josephine, not Johanna. I'm sorry about that.
Jill and Anders, please.
But I will leave it to you.
You will never forget my name.
No, I will not.
Please, let me have Jill here and Javier in the middle, and then Anders. Thank you for that warm welcome, Anna, and welcome again to all of you here in the room and those of you who are watching this later on, digitally, online, as we're also recording this conversation. And those of you who are here, you get the VIP treatment of being able to ask questions later on. So please raise your hands if anything's unclear or questions come up. I'll try to add them to the conversation. I've also told these three gentlemen that we'll try to have a conversation between us three. So we'll see how that goes. Challenge accepted. Yes, so I'm Josephine. I'm the interim head of communications here at the Swedish Red Cross. And from the outside, and I guess for many of you here in the room, the Red Cross is one organization, and we are in many ways, but we're a family of several family members, and we have the opportunity of having two of our international family members here today from the ICRC and the IFRC. And I'm not going to dwell on introductions, because what is interesting is actually what we are doing on the ground in Ukraine. And I would like to start up with you, Gilles. As Anna said, you're the vice president of ICRC, the International Red Cross Committee, and you operate in several conflicts. Ukraine is just one of several, and that means you were already in Ukraine, the eastern parts, before the conflict escalated. What were you doing then, and what has happened with your operations since? Quite a lot, I can imagine.
Well, you are totally right, Josephine. We were in Ukraine already for many years, but I'd like also to, say how glad I am to be with you here and to be able to share a bit the reality on the ground that we have witnessed, especially from the 24th of February onwards, and what we have been able to do also thanks to, very generous people and a huge global solidarity move that we have seen and that enable us to really act. So what has happened is that we, the International Committee of the Red Cross, we work in armed conflicts. So we have been very much present during the armed conflict in 2014. And since then, we had about 600 staff working with the Ukrainian Red Cross volunteers. We have seen some of them on the screen. And we were working on both sides of the line of contact between offices in Donetsk and Luhansk, but also in Severodonetsk, whom we speak a lot of this town now. We had also an office in Mariupol, and so forth. And during 8 years, we have been doing our role of assisting the people suffering from daily shelling and daily actually conflict, ongoing conflict, daily artillery and so forth. And during 8 years, we were also making sure, for instance, that pensioners in the non-governmental control area, the elders, they could get the pension across line from the Ukraine government. That health assistance, that water would be provided, and we engaged the parties to the conflict so that they would protect the water pipes and the wastewater treatment plants so that we could maintain sanitation afloat. And it's been a huge shock to see suddenly complete escalation in the conflict across Ukraine. We have opened offices in 10 locations and have mobile teams because it's very fluid. So we have our mobile team going very close to the where the hostilities are happening. And I think no one can overstate the tragedy. No one can really exaggerate the tragic human toll this war is taking. It's an international armed conflict that has a huge human cost on civilians and civilian infrastructure. So we know here in Sweden, like in my country, Switzerland, that we have over 7 million Ukrainians who cross the border to flee the fighting and come cross the border as refugees, over 5 million, but we have 7 million Ukrainians who are displaced within Ukraine and hosted with their families, with relatives, or in shelters. So we provided immediately shelters, we provided food assistance, we provided medical assistance to the hospitals and to the health centers. And overall, we have managed to bring over 3,000 tons of drugs, medicine, surgical material for war wounded, but also insulin and other very vital drugs for chronic diseases so that they could continue to treat the wounded. And there is a whole other set of activities where we have heavily invested, which is engaging what we call the parties to the conflict. Maybe I'll come back to this later because, of course, the Geneva Conventions, international humanitarian law applies. And it means that civilians and civilian objects should be protected. And this is the type of dialogue that we are having with all the parties to the conflict.
Let us come back to this engagement with parties, because I think this is something that we've gotten questions about, and I think that many are wondering about. And you mentioned a very concrete example, perhaps, that we can come back to, actually protecting water pipes. Is that even possible during an armed conflict to engage parties to protect certain infrastructure, for instance? I think that's an interesting issue, but let's come back to that. And I'll continue to you, Javier, and you can comment, of course, on what Gilles been saying. You recently visited Ukraine. Do you share this image? Because, I mean, you work in very complex and complicated crises as well.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much. It's such a privilege to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and deep gratitude to all of you that have trust on the Swedish Red Cross, for all of us to be able to reach people in need. When we look at International Federation, what we do, at the end of the day, for us, the sustainability of humanitarian action in a given country, and in this case Ukraine, depends on Red Cross societies capable to deliver humanitarian services. And that means investing in their capacities, in their preparedness, in their engagement, in their acceptance from the communities and people in the country is a crucial component for any work that we do. So during the Ukraine crisis, the National Society, with the support of the network of national societies, have already mobilized 13,000 tons of humanitarian aid. That means to mobilize 13,000 tons of humanitarian aid, that there is a need of capacities in local branches, in headquarters, the conditions to be able to operate and to deliver humanitarian services. So one of the key elements that we play is to strengthen the capacities of the National Red Cross Society of Ukraine.
And when we talk about capacities, what do we mean? For someone who doesn't know,
okay,
how would you go about it?
Well, let me put probably three major points. One is related to human resources in terms of volunteering. This national society moved from 3,000 volunteers to 8,000 volunteers during the crisis. So building those capacities in order to train those volunteers, to have the conditions to operate in situations of safety that requires extra attention. The second one is about systems, how the national systems are developed to ensure accountability, transparency, that are able to operate. And the third one is the capacity of local branches and the connectiveness with the headquarters, how that works, how that flows, what are the issues that need to be improved. So this operation also helps, at the same time that we are helping to reach to people in need, to strengthen those connections between the network of a national society that has over 200 local branches in the country.
That's a good reminder that the Red Cross is really made up of its volunteers, but they also need support, especially when you're going from a country that, to a large extent, was living in peace, apart from parts, and then suddenly in conflict. You also visited Ukraine recently. And you are one of the national societies that Javier is talking about that have really rallied to help the Ukrainian Red Cross and also, of course, the countries around Ukraine. What would you like to add to the picture that they've painted here?
No, thank you, Josephine. May I just start by actually just acknowledging that I have my colleagues in the room, with Lisa and Marie and Karina and Andre. And just really express to you as our donors to this conflict, just the immense, not only gratitude, because that's one thing, but really the humility by which we're receiving this and the responsibility by which we're taking this on. I've been in this business of humanitarian development all my life, 30 years, most recently 15 years with the United Nations. And this is absolutely an outstanding operation in so many different ways. I think I can tell you that with some trust and some legitimacy. So thank you, and thank you to my colleagues. They are the ones that are actually delivering. And I think I can assure you, we as the Swedish Red Cross, we are there. We are pretty good at what we're doing, but we're also very humble in terms of how difficult this is. This is difficult, and everybody that would say it differently, to say this is just a piece of cake, it's not true. This is difficult to actually get it right. So let's acknowledge that. I mean, we are a member of the Federation of the Red Cross, and I think I'm always thinking in terms of what is the uniqueness of the Red Cross, me coming from the United Nations. That is actually, we were there before it started. We were there before the 24th February, and we, as one of the 192 national societies, we've been able to contribute to that we have a national Red Cross society in Ukraine that at a situation when nobody was expecting that anything like this would actually happen, still was prepared. And that's the uniqueness as far as I am concerned. On 24 February, on the day of the escalation, we as a Red Cross movement, we actually could immediately respond. That's what the Red Cross is. And we could do that precisely like Xavier and Gilles says, because we have the volunteers on the ground, they're ready to respond, and we have a national society, an NGO, that actually is there capable of doing this. That's what the Red Cross for me is all about.
Mm-hmm.
And it got quiet.
No, I'm thinking, because I would also like to add, because you were touching upon the complexity here. We're helping, most definitely, but it's also tricky. We have volunteers trying to reach so many people in need. What is the biggest challenge right now, would you say? And you can jump at it.
Well, let me jump here. You know, let's put the human side. Soon, in 3 days, will be 100 days of this operation. When you look at the mental health and taking decisions when stress is higher is a significant problem to overcome. And I would say that is one of the key elements that we need to take into consideration. The third one is that this operation is escalating beyond Ukraine, right? We know that neighboring countries are receiving almost 6 million people, but we know that it's having critical effects and consequences around the globe in terms of food insecurity. And the third element in terms of this operation itself in Ukraine is that at the same time that we have an operation that is focused and concentrated where ICRC is performing a major role, what we are seeing that the internal displaced people have lost all the means to live. They are fully dependent of international organizations like ours or from the government that will be able to provide services. So that increases significantly the challenge. And the biggest problem ahead will be that sooner or later, Ukraine will be a protracted crisis where nobody's going to talk about it. And that is going to be a big, big challenge for the entire people that is in need. I will put it those three elements.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this long-term perspective is something that you often raise. Anders, do you want to comment before I give the hand to?
No, but it's absolutely true. In a way, right now, and still 100 days, the attention is on Ukraine. And of course, given the geographical location of Ukraine, we will have an attention span of Ukraine that goes way beyond what you normally see. I spent the last 5 years in the Middle East on Syria, right? You know how it goes. How many today speak about Syria? How many today speak about Afghanistan? How many today speak about Yemen? The attention span is very, very short. I think what Xavier says is absolutely key. So in my capacity with my colleagues, the most difficult thing right now is actually to be able to find a way for us to be actually sustainable, for actually to be predictable, for us to be there also 2023, 24, 25. That's going to be the big challenge. When we know the needs they will be as big as they are today, but much less people actually watching it and being interested in engaging. And that's when we have to be there. The suffering is the same. That's when it's going to become really difficult in many ways. And again, that I think is the Red Cross.
You mentioned these IDPs internally displaced people, so people fleeing within Ukraine. What do we then do to help? You mentioned their needs.
Well, I think I'd like to build a bit on what Xavier and Anders have been saying. But Today, we are actually supporting 20 water boards, water utilities, to provide drinking water despite the war to all of them, and to ensure that there is sanitation. It's about 8 million people directly benefiting from what the Red Cross does in support of the water systems. We are supporting, it's a middle-income country. It had strong structures. We are supporting these structures rather than inventing a new structure which is parallel and which would destroy what was there. We are rather trying to preserve and maintain what was there to service the people. We are also having some cash assistance program because we do provide food. But some people tell us, look, when you give us food, we have to sell on the market part of what you give us to get the cash to then be able to purchase what we need as IDPs, as internal displaced people, or as families receiving and hosting IDPs. And we have a very strong and strict way to check and control that the cash has arrived exactly where it should go, via either the Ministry of Social Affairs or directly. And there, I must say that I was struck because you mentioned mental health. And we have a system where Ukrainians can call us 24/7, 24 hours per day, all the week long, and we are overwhelmed by calls from people, parents who are desperate to say, look, my children don't sleep, they keep crying, shouting, they are traumatized, what shall I do? And themselves as parents, they are also traumatized. And the issue is that our volunteers, they have families in the same place. They receive these stories day long, and we need more of them because the demand is much higher. And I think in the long run, there is a need to invest a lot also in mental health and psychosocial support. So it's a complex web that we have to provide to the IDPs, but also, it's water systems, it's electricity, which is needed to ensure that hospitals have electricity, that water pumping stations can run, and it's the whole infrastructure in cities. And when we see, like today, war in Severodonetsk, urban warfare is extremely detrimental because it hits directly civilians, but it also destroys civilian infrastructure, which is vital. So what we do is to try to protect the civilians and maintain this vital structure up and running. And this requires also reminding the Russians and all the others of their obligations under international humanitarian law to protect the civilians and not to target civilian objects.
Because you give me a bridge there into going back to your example from before of engagement with the parties, trying to protect something as concrete as water pipes. Does it work?
It did work amazingly well during the almost 8 years of conflict that I referred to between 2014 and 2022. In the Donbass, we had agreements between the parties not to have a safe zone where we had the water pipes and of essential infrastructure. So with a few exceptions, we could maintain, provide safety to this zone. But this is complete, you have to negotiate that on a daily basis, and we have to engage also the parties. So that's, maybe you were asking before, what is the main challenge? One of the key challenges for us is that the situation is so polarized in this hybrid type of warfare, where we have actually warfare on the ground, of course, but it's also warfare on the social media, information warfare, disinformation campaigns, that it is extremely difficult sometimes for the Red Cross to explain we are a neutral humanitarian organization. We are not, it's not our role to start accusing one side and saying we are here against one side. We have to be strongly engaged for the victims of this conflict, but we have to stay neutral. And this space for neutral engagement has shrunk, and we have been targeted by a disinformation campaign, very violent, which was saying on social media, the Red Cross, they are discussing with the Russians, so they are negotiating to deport, to have the massive deportation of Ukrainians to Russia. And the next second, volunteers of the Ukrainian Red Cross were threatened at checkpoints, and our own staff as well. And this was completely fake news, and we had to, we were not used as Red Cross to be directly attacked by such a disinformation campaign, and it goes viral instantly. So we are learning how also to redress and put the facts right, and try not to be directly the victims of such a disinformation campaign. And this just shows how polarized and how sensitive the situation is, and this is what you have mentioned, the sensitivity of being able to ensure the security of our staff, the security of volunteers, especially when we try to work, as we did, cross-line, for instance, to ensure safe passage of civilians from Mariupol, and, of course, registering the prisoners of war who surrendered in Mariupol, for instance.
Yes, you mentioned several of the tasks of the Red Cross in a conflict. Is this, and I'm looking if there are any hands up, but would you say that this is a new development when it comes to conflicts? Are we seeing a new discussion on the principles, the humanitarian, the possibilities of humanitarian access, which is what we're talking about, and the respect for our neutrality as an organization?
I would say, do you want to go ahead?
Well, now we're fighting on it. That's a good one. Well, I have often been given the question by media, by the way, so what is so unique about Ukraine? And there's a couple of things that are absolutely unique about Ukraine, including the fact that, according to international public law, it's an international conflict. We don't have many of those, fortunately, around the world. So in that regard, it is. But it's more to say, my response has been the similarities in between the conflict in Ukraine and the Syrias and so many other places. And I'm saying this because, in my humble opinion, and with my background, having worked in many of the other conflict settings, what you've been seeing over the years is actually how the principles have been eroded. That's the big thing. And of course, once again, we see in Ukraine all of this accelerated. They have become even more of it. But if I go back my last 5 years in Jordan, working very, very much with Syria, I mean, every principle has been, one way or the other, being violated, right? Everything that has to do about humanitarian access, standing up for the civilians, not targeting the specific goals, etc., etc. So we see a trend that is extremely worrying. But that you can say about human rights at large, if I may put it like that. So in that regard, I think it's a continuation, it's an acceleration, it's an expansion on the Ukraine, but it didn't start on 24 February.
Yeah.
And still we hear examples of how it works, even in this conflict, which is interesting at the same time.
Absolutely.
What probably, I fully agree, Anders, on what you said. If we look from the humanitarian action point of view, we always said the key point is to have access and acceptance. And sometimes the acceptance and the access is granted by governments, but not granted by communities. So it is not enough when a government says, yes, you have access and acceptance, if the community does not offer you that. What Ukraine has challenged, in my view, which is the difference, is how the role of social media and the communication campaign around social media in a magnitude that we have not seen in the past, right? So I will call the geopolitics of the social media in today's world will require organizations like us to say how we have to present ourselves in terms of communication in order to learn how to deal with that. But when we look into the actual work, what has happened is, if you look, health facilities, 200 health facilities have been destroyed. That happened in different conflicts around the world. The schools, over 1,000 schools have been destroyed or damaged. So what I'm trying to say is that access to health services of education are affecting badly in Ukraine, as has happened in the past. The difficulty now is how that organizations like ICRC or Ukrainian Red Cross Society that have been in the front line have been able to access when the population is receiving a conflicting message in terms of what is a principle-based humanitarian organization doing. And I think that for us also is a message to the governments as well, how governments have to protect a principled humanitarian organizations, because it's critical to always use an opportunity to send the message that from governments, from opinion leaders, that saying these organizations are playing a humanitarian role that is neutral, impartial, independent. And I think that is something that for us also is a learning in terms of how we have to address it.
But how does that then work on the local level? Because we're talking here about 13,000 tons of humanitarian aid that has still reached the population. So we are doing this in this very polarized conflict. How does that even work then? Because listening to you, it might sound that it's extremely dangerous, but still it's being done, and we reach people.
Well, I will leave to Gilles to speak about the conflict zones, because I think, let's be very clear, all of Ukraine doesn't look the same. If you are in Lviv in the western part of the country, it's very, very different from what Gilles is describing from the eastern part. So, as you always have in conflicts, right? It was the same thing in Syria. You were visiting nice restaurants in Damascus while you had fully fledged war just in the outskirts. That's the way conflicts very often look like. And the same thing in Ukraine. When I was there, and you were there recently, you traveled there every second week, something like that, Gilles. I mean, you can be there and you can have the nicest kind of Drottninggatan kind of an experience in Lviv in Ukraine right now, isn't it? That's where you stay, by the way, on that street. So you can have that one, right? While you have Mariupol and everything that's happening simultaneously. So that's, and I think what I'm as a humanitarian, that is what we want to call ourselves like, as a humanitarian, is of course the sophistication of the response, because we have a very atypical situation. Rarely we are typically engaged in a situation when you have a functioning state, and actually a state with a functioning social security system that still, under these circumstances, they do deliver safety to its people. So we as humanitarians, we cannot just step in and take over, which we're pretty good at in many places, and actually respect systems, respect structures, and support them, right? And I want to be very open about the sophistication of the response and how do we actually get on with it. It is not just like you roll in like, the big internationals and take over. That's bad humanitarian work. You work and build on systems and structures in place, and you build from, of course, then some things takes more time. But it's the only way to make this actually sustainable. Then, of course, just to know, we finance now the ICRC and their work, and that's your money, so you know that's what they do.
No, we're indeed extremely grateful because needs are just huge. You mentioned the diversity, but the sheer number of internally displaced people also in Lviv and other cities in the West. And in all neighboring countries, including Sweden. But of course, what we see is that we have people who have spent weeks, under the rubble in basements, and sometimes no food, no water for 1 or 2 days in a row. A dramatic situation, which are ongoing right now as we speak in some of the places near Severodonetsk. And we have also, a level of destruction which will require massive investment. So we do reach these places, but to reach these places, we need to get agreements. And to get agreements, if we say we don't want to speak to that or this party, we don't go there. The only way we could go to Mariupol and we could do 3 or 4 safe passages, same thing in Sumy, is by discussing with the Ukrainians, with the Russians, with the armed forces, all the way from the capital to the local commanders and those in charge of checkpoints, and to make sure that on that day, at that time, through that route, there are no landmines on the road, there will be no shelling when we go and take the lead of a long convoy to bring civilians out, and that we will be able to go there. 220 kilometers to go from Mariupol to Zaporizhzhia, it took 3 days. But we did it. And the only way to do that is to get the agreement of parties so that we can also make sure that the people we are entrusted with will be safe and our own staff and volunteers will be safe. And this sometimes works. And it's true in the media, you always see what doesn't work because, that's what makes head news. But it's very interesting to look. We have one, database called International Humanitarian Law in Action. And students from all over the world study why this ambulance could go through a checkpoint bringing an enemy, and at the checkpoints, they said, please go to the hospital and treat this combatant even if he's from the other side. How come this was done? Why did the commander decide, I don't shoot now on that hospital because I shouldn't do that? So there are daily instances, fortunately, where it works, and it's through this convincing, this constant engagement with the parties on their responsibility. So fortunately, it works, and this enables then our work, where we bring what you enable us to do, which is vital assistance and also protection to prevent some of the bad from happening. And I think it's also what the Red Cross does, is to prevent the worst from happening. And obviously, it's always more difficult to document and speak of a bad that could be prevented than to document and have pictures, which are very, interesting for communication purposes of bad happening. Mm-hmm. So this is a bit what we do. But this being said, what is very, not dissimilar from other conflicts is the suffering always of the same vulnerable people, civilians, children, women, elders who don't want to leave, by the way, and they stay in horrible conditions. And we see this in Syria, we see this in South Sudan, we see this in Yemen, and the same thing in Ukraine. And exactly as Anders and Xavier said, what is new is the level of information warfare through instant social media, and also some of the cyber aspect of the war. And for this, it adds a complexity to our work, and we are learning, sometimes the hard way, but we are learning fast.
I still see no hands up. Here we have a question.
Thank you so much.
You say it and I'll repeat it because we don't have a microphone.
Can you talk a little bit more about the training of the international humanitarian laws? I mean, in the conflict zones, outside the conflict zones, and how we work together on that, perhaps.
So there was a question on training of international humanitarian law.
That's your question.
Yeah. Well,
and I will ask you to keep it quite short, but
I will
please.
try to be short. It goes all the way from, I start with the macro level. We have states, and we push states first to sign and ratify treaties. Once it is done, we work with states to translate this into the national legislation. And once it's in the national legislation, it must be in the military doctrine and in the military manuals. When it's done, we make sure that it's translated into the curriculum, the training curriculum for soldiers, for commanders, for non-state, we engage also non-state armed groups on international humanitarian law. And once this is done, we do participate in training programs. We train trainers within the armed forces apparatus all across the world, in peacetime as in wartime. And then what we do is that we have also now 3D simulations, because the issue is that we have studied a lot when it works and when it doesn't. And sometimes, it's when you see young kids playing a video game with a word, they just say, no, in the heat of combat, this is where you have restraint. And if you are not trained to have this restraint in the heat of combat, and you don't have a commander saying, okay, you will be sanctioned, these are two things that must go hand in hand. So we are pushing very much on this end of, the web of prevention. And finally, we document violations. And once we have documented violations, we engage confidentially with those responsible for the violations. And this is a confidential dialogue, so our role, contrary to others, is not to advocate publicly and refer to an international criminal tribunal. Our role is to document allegations, but also to do a very, forensic work and so forth, and then to go and say to those commanders we had engaged over years on their obligations under international humanitarian law, especially in an international conflict where all the Geneva Conventions and the first additional protocol fully apply to both parties, then we engage in a very, I would say, very direct flank dialogue where we want to see improvements. So that's basically the work, and I'm a bit too long, but
No.
I get passionate about it.
Well, we could also mention that this is also something that national societies often do, like the Swedish Red Cross does with the Swedish Armed Forces as well.
Yeah,
so this is
absolutely.
really, again, where we're a family when it comes to international humanitarian law. I'm going to give you all a final question, maybe not a happy question, but we're coming close to 100 days, as you said. What is your time perspective on Ukraine, the people in Ukraine needing our help and assistance? If you look ahead, what is your time perspective? And this will also give you the opportunity to say a few other words if there's something that you haven't been able to mention.
Decades. That's the truth. The average time of any refugee displacement anywhere in the world is around 20 plus years. If there's something we know about conflicts, it is its protractedness, and that we see all over the world. And that's precisely what makes this so exceptionally important, that we have an opportunity to be sustainable. So my add-on message on this one, actually, Josephine, is number one, thank you for your contribution. Allow us to be sustainable and not finding ourselves in a situation when we have to spend money quickly, short term. That's not the biggest need today. The biggest need today is to be sustainable and to really have a vision, not a vision, but actually to have a sight on what's coming beyond the first 100 days. The second one is very clearly, don't forget the rest of the world. The Africa Horn right now is in its deepest hunger crisis for decades. We have almost no funding. It's below 9% of the Federation funding for the Horn of Africa right now. It's a crisis in the making. It is as severe for the people as what we are seeing in Ukraine, but there's no limelight, there's no CNN, and there's no news. That's the biggest thing right now.
Yeah, I will probably put in the same line, the conflict itself is not going to end soon. If we are lucky, it will end in the coming 5-6 months. If we are not lucky, it will be end of the year. But in reality, the consequences of the conflict in general will be, as you mentioned, decades. And I think this is not an easy answer to put it in place. But if I would like to use your point. To me, the most critical element when a humanitarian crisis happens is that when a crisis happens, fulfills 3 conditions. It has to be spectacular, it has to be extraordinary, and it has to be unexpected. Then all the eyes of the world are looking at it. Today, every 10 seconds, die a child in the world because they don't have nothing to eat. And they die as simple as that. Right? Because it is no longer spectacular, extraordinary, or unexpected. It's happening. So the biggest challenges that we have in Ukraine for how long will be in the sad moment that we are going to say we have forgotten the millions of people in need. And sooner or later, many of the refugees around the world that are from Ukraine will not be so good and so well accepted by their own communities. And they will need even more support. So what is you describe of decades also comes with an additional problems that we have not seen it yet. And that's why it's so important to be on top and to try to support them in the best possible way. And as you said, crises around the globe are really high. It's predicted more than 300 million people that will be food insecurity by the end of this year.
Thank you, Javier. Gilles, I will ask you to be super short, but still give your comment.
Well, difficult to be short with your question.
I know.
But I think, once recently an Afghan told me, your Second World War lasted just 6 years. It was very short. For me, I'm the third generation in a row living in an armed conflict. It's our normal life. My grandfather, my father, myself, 40 years. And this is what we are facing today. So will Ukraine follow suit? We've been there already for 8 years. It was not in the limelight until the 24th of February. And what I see now is narratives and build-up in armament and weapons that are not, let's say, leading to think that tomorrow we will find a political solution, because there is no humanitarian solution to this humanitarian crisis. And for you, donors, supporters, people with solidarity, it can be depressing. Because you say, well, I've been donating, but the world doesn't go, it doesn't look better. But actually, the number of lives saved, the number, the sheer level of suffering that is alleviated is just absolutely outstanding. And as we stand for humanity, I think, we must fight for that, and it's worth it. So this is our role. Maybe when we try to bring the parties together to find humanitarian solutions to restitute dead bodies to their different families across the lines, we start to speak about the dead, and maybe it provides an enabling environment to start discussing later on about those who are still alive. And we hope that it provides an enabling environment for talks which might be more conducive to finding solutions. So we do contribute somehow to that, but it's tough, and it's not done. And my last point is that the knock-on effects are just huge. I was yesterday with a minister of a major agricultural exporting country telling me, look, we cannot import our fertilizers. So this crop this year will be dramatically reduced, and this will contribute to add to the 300 plus million highly food insecure today in Africa. And we see also logistically the difficulty that we have now to bring food assistance to those places, especially in the Horn of Africa and the Sahel. So indeed, solidarity is needed worldwide, all the more that we see that some of the budgets that were allocated for solidarity and aid, certainly not in Sweden, but in some countries, is reallocated to defense. And we are neutral, so we don't express our view, but we just say, please do not stop supporting not only our effort in Ukraine, but the effort that we must do beyond.
Thank you for both reminding us of the broader consequences, the long-term perspective, but also warm thank you for reminding us of the dialogue that doesn't necessarily reach the media and the public sphere, that it's always ongoing, which I think is super important for us to remind ourselves of. Thank you. I've actually used 5 more minutes than allowed, but Anna, please
Then I will be quite
wave us off.
quite short. I would actually just say then, thank you, Xavier. Thank you, Gilles. Thank you, Anders. Thank you, Josephine. And then I would like also to say thank you to all of you who are actually supporting us, because we cannot do this without your support. And I think we will try to say thank you to you by showing this video. have a chance actually to talk about what we are doing in Sweden. I mean, we talked quite a lot about what we are doing in Ukraine, but you should know, of course, that we are also very engaged in this in Sweden as well as in the rest of Europe. What are we doing in Sweden then? Well, we are actually receiving a lot of refugees, of course, and trying to work with integration programs. We have been at the reception centers, we are at the different migration bureaus, but most of all, we are now trying to get the Ukrainian people to feel welcome into the Swedish society. So I would actually ask you, I know that you are really supporting us in a financial way, but please help us also to welcome all the refugees to the Swedish society, because that is something that we are also quite working with. Thank you. And thank you.